Hello, my friends. I'm not able to be with you today because it is a teacher work day. We are learning, but I wanted to go ahead and give you a video to tell you a little bit more about human development, specifically to speak to Kohlberg and Freud, who we'll be talking about today. And I do want to just point out quickly, the interim assessment 2 will be opening Friday, October 27th, closing Monday, November 6th. So make sure you look at that and make sure you're getting those pathway to mastery activities. There were 6 in this cycle, so as long as you have 5 done, you're fine. If you did all 6 and one you didn't do well on, but you did great on the other 5, awesome, you're good to go. All right, come on, mouse. There we go. So, as always, our vision, mission, and Class Connect Fab 4, I know how much you live for those. And the things we'll be thinking about today, for Kohlberg, we'll be thinking about what motivates people to behave as they do in each of Kohlberg's stages. And we'll think about in which stage of Kohlberg stages are most people. You'll find that most people don't go beyond a certain stage. But then I also thought it was interesting to think about superheroes like Captain America or Iron Man and what stage they might be in and why. So that's just a little brain exercise for you. And also Freud. According to Freud, what is the essence of life and what is in conflict with it? And whether or not we are aware of most of our urges and thoughts and why. So we'll be looking at the structure of personality and what motivates us to. All right, so we're going to start with our friend Kohlberg. And Kohlberg was heavily influenced by Jean Piaget. Remember him? The guy who was the first one to kind of come up with the idea that children had stages of learning. And he said that you make moral decisions based on your ability to morally reason. So, for example, if you think about Piaget, he talked about how younger kids were very concrete. They needed to touch things or there needed to be a personal connection. Well, you're not going to be able to make some kind of abstract reasoning about love and justice or morality when you're in that stage. So he said that Piaget's stages kind of corresponded. He said there are 6 stages of moral development, but not everybody gets through all 6. In fact, most people get stopped at one particular stage, and we'll talk about that. So we're going to start over here with the pre-conventional level, which is the self-interest level. And again, if you think about little kids and you think about like elementary school kids or even pre-K kids, you're kind of in that self-interest bubble. You're kind of, exploring yourself and what interests me and what do I think is right and what do I think is fair. And it's less about kind of society and more about you personally. So the first stage is punishment and obedience. You've seen little kids. They start to do something, you turn and go, and they stop because they know they're going to get in trouble. So generally in stage 1, which is where we all start out, if we know we're going to get in trouble, we don't do it. If we think we can get away with it, we might get slick. You ever watch little kids and you think, how did you think that I was not going to notice? Well, they don't know. Stage 2 is what we call the instrumental exchange. This is kind of elementary school. If you ever had a kid who you say, well, can you help me with something? They go, maybe. What you going to do for me? What you going to give me? That instrumental exchange. You scratch my back, I'll scratch yours. And it's really about, again, self-interest. What will I get out of this? The next level, we move to conventional level. This is where you start to look at what society expects and make decisions based on society. And so we're kind of moving up into the middle school years, if you will. And stage 3 is very middle school. It's the good boy, nice girl. Think about it. Do you notice people who's like they're obsessed? Well, what does my friend think? Well, what does this person think? Well, I can't do that unless this person thinks it's okay. That's stage 3. You are looking at what other people are doing and you're relying on society and your friends and the people around you to decide if your behavior is appropriate or not. So your decisions are really based on kind of what's going on around you. And then, of course, stage 4, this is the stage most people stop at. This is the law and order stage. And if any of you are fans of law and order, whenever I get to stage 4, I always hear the dun dun in my head. If you don't know law and order, don't worry, you don't get that. But so this is about the rules in a society. Okay, so whatever laws have been established, those are the most important things to follow in stage 4. And a lot of people, they stop here, and there's nothing wrong with that. But the moral development is that's the law, then that's the way it goes. But then we move on, if you'll notice, the third level to the post-conventional level. And this is where you've gone beyond what society expects and what the people around you expect and into what you as a person think is right or wrong. And a lot of people like to think they're at this stage, and I'm not sitting here telling you where you are or not. But this is a really tough stage because this is where you may be in conflict with society and you may be in conflict with everyone around you, but you're making a decision based on what you truly believe is best for the community or best for the group. Again, it's really easy to get confused between the pre-conventional level and the post-conventional level. But the difference is in the pre-conventional level, we're all about ourselves. What do I get out of it? And in the post-conventional level, we're making decisions that we believe are for the good of the group or the good of the person or the good of the society, and we're willing to accept the consequences if we have them, but we're not looking to do something that may or may not provide self-gain. So stage 5 gets into social contracts. So you're thinking about the laws and the values of society, but you're also thinking about your own. And you're willing to make some decisions that may go against what other people think. You know, a good example, let's imagine that a child is invited to a birthday party and that child misbehaves. Now, the parent knows that the other parents expect the child at the birthday party, but they also know that their child's behavior is such that if they reward the child with the birthday party, well, the kid's just going to get worse, right? So they make the decision to keep the child home, knowing the other parent will be very disappointed, and knowing they may even have conflict with that other parent. So stage 5 gets into looking at what is best in a situation that may or may not click with the rest of society. And then stage 6, moving on to a universal principle. So you make decisions about what is right or wrong based solely on the universal principles you have inside. Some may conflict with the laws, some may be equal to the laws. But for you, what's important is not laws in society, but the principles that you have. For example, I think of Iron Man. Especially if any of you have seen the second Avengers, where he decides to build the vision, the body, even though he knows that everyone else thinks it's a really bad idea and he shouldn't. But he's moved into a universal principle. He's looking at his own ethical principles, which is that the human race must be saved, and it's more important to keep them safe than to listen to any laws. So that's just what pops in my head. If you're not a Marvel fan, I apologize. It probably didn't help you too much. All right, so Kohlberg had a very interesting way of researching his theory. He created something he called the Heinz dilemma. And it was a story that he told to the children in his study. So he said there's a man named Heinz who has a wife dying from a particular type of cancer. And there is a drug that was invented to cure her disease. But the man who invented it, the pharmacist, was selling it for way too much money. So Heinz goes to his friends and family. He says, hey, can you guys give me half the money? Then he goes to the pharmacist and he says, listen, I have half the money. Would you either lower the price and accept this, or would you let me give you the other half over time? The pharmacist says, no, I worked really hard on this. I deserve the money that I could make off this. And Heinz becomes so desperate because of his incredible love for his wife and her situation that he breaks into the pharmacist store later that night and steals the drugs. So that is the Heinz dilemma. Now let's take a look at who was in his study. Kohlberg brought in 72 boys from Chicago, ages 10 to 16 years old. And after he told them the story, he asked them 4 questions. The first one is, should Heinz have stolen the drug? So take a moment and tell me, or just in your head, what do you think? Second, would it change anything if Heinz did not love his wife? You know, I told you that he loved her deeply. Well, what if he didn't really care about her? Oops, sorry, the 3 and 4 popped up. 3, what if the person dying was a stranger? Would that make difference if it was someone he didn't know? And 4, Should the police arrest the pharmacist for murder if the woman died? I mean, keeping in mind that he could save her. Well, take a look at this study and statistical sample. Notice who you have here, 72 boys from Chicago aged 10 to 16 years old. And think about this. Do you off the bat recognize any potential problems that Kohlberg could run into based on how he did this? Maybe, maybe not. Well, let's take a look. Oh, but before we do, here is your cycle 2, week 5. Take it out the door for moral development. And your password is Kohlberg, all lowercase. I ask you to contrast pre-conventional moral development with post-conventional morality and give an example of each. So remember, pre-conventional moral development is all about me, self-interest. What do I get out of this? How can I, am I going to get punished? All concerned with yourself. You'll break the law if you think you can get away with it. Post-conventional morality has to do with these internalized principles that don't always agree with society, and you may break the law because you think it's right, but you're willing to accept the punishment or you're willing to accept the situation you're in. And I thought this was a pretty funny comic about it. Here, this guy's saying, hey, man, I just found out that stealing bread is illegal. And this guy's like, well, yeah, that's true. He's like, yeah, but I heard this story one time when I was a kid that it was okay. And he's saying, well, you're probably thinking about a time that it's morally okay to steal a loaf of bread to feed your family, but that doesn't make it legal. I love that. Man, I guess I should stop hijacking bread trucks then. So you think about it, this guy's in pre-conventional, he's worried about himself. What can I have? This guy may be more in the post-conventional. Okay, you're going to do something that's illegal. Just keep in mind you're going to get in trouble, but you have to accept that. All right, so let's jump back to our issues with Kohlberg's research. Kohlberg used a very artificial dilemma. I mean, there is no guy named Heinz. There's no wife. This is a story that's deliberately manufactured to create emotion. He used it on kids ages 10 to 16. These kids weren't married. They don't know what it's like to be married. I mean, they may not have even had a significant other, so they don't really understand where this could come from. His research was cross-sectional. It was not longitudinal. So they came up to these boys, they asked them their opinion, and then that was it. But what if their opinion changes over time? How do we know that people actually go through these situations, especially since most of these kids may not have even hit stage 4 yet? But what was interesting is afterwards, a group of psychologists interviewed 58 of the original participants, and every 3 years they would go back to them and give them the Heinz dilemma again and ask them what they thought. And they found that these boys did pass through these stages of morality. So some of them began to change their answers as they got older, and then some of them, as they went through life experiences, began to change whether or not they were looking at society's laws versus their own internal principles. But there's one more really significant thing, and that came from a woman named Carol Gilligan. And she took a look at this and she said, wait a minute, everyone you used in the study is a boy. And guys look at the world differently than ladies look at the world. So if a woman is looking at basing her morality on a principle of compassion or care, she might come across as self-interested, when in reality, from a woman's point of view, she could be in a different stage. Now, Kohlberg did recognize this bias, and shortly before his death in 1987, he began to try and work on gender bias, but again, he died, so he didn't really get to do anything. But it brings up an interesting point. Can ignoring gender present present issues with psychological findings? Sorry, wrong pronunciation there. So, is gender important in psychology? Do we need to consider it? That became a big issue, and there's a lot of people on either side of the fence. So that's something to think about. All right, then we have our friend Freud. Welcome back, Freud. We have 3 major parts to Freud's psychoanalytical theory. The theory of personality dynamics, which has to do with what level of consciousness are you at. the theory of personality structure, which has to do with the different parts of your personality, and the theory of psychosexual development. So Freud gets rather interesting, and some of my friends have told me that they find this very uncomfortable, they're worried about it. Please note that whether or not you agree with Freud, it is very important to understand his techniques to see the kinds of ideas that have come before where we are today. So the first thing I want to address is that first part, that level of consciousness. And Freud believes that we have the conscious mind, which is our active mind. This is where our fantasies are, our memories, our thoughts, where you probably are right now as you're listening to me. You're paying attention to what's going on in front of you. But we also have that pre-conscious mind, that available memory. So we can go in there and grab a memory and pull out. It's not hard to make it conscious. It's probably going on kind of in the background. Have you ever had like a song going on in the back of your head and you continue with the rest of your day, but that song's just always kind of there? That's your pre-conscious mind. And then your unconscious mind. This one we're not really aware of. There's may have a lot of repressed motives, memories, and emotions kind of tucked back there, and this could be where conflicts are coming from. And Freud says, trust me, I'm a doctor. Now, Freud also alluded to the structure of our personality, and it's a very interesting idea. According to Freud, we have three parts to our personality: the id, the ego, and the superego. And the idea is, if you take a look, this is that line of consciousness versus pre-consciousness. Notice, according to Freud, we're like an iceberg. The majority of our thoughts are below the surface. So got to go back, hold on. What's conscious for us, what we're aware of, is that ego, and I'll talk about that in a moment. But notice that although the superego has a little bitty piece sticking up over the conscious, most of what's going on for us is something we're not even aware of. Okay, moving on. So the id, let's talk about the id, which was that huge chunk underneath in the unconscious area. The id is our original system of personality. It's all about pleasure. And by pleasure, I mean wanting to do the things that make us happy. You know, would you rather play video games or would you rather do your homework? Well, if you're saying, I want to go play a video game, that's your id at work. It wants to do what's fun. It wants to do what makes you happy. You know, eating the chocolate versus eating the broccoli, for example. And it generally is kind of our reservoir of psychic energy. So if our id is happy, we kind of feel happy. If our id is unhappy, we're having trouble. Then we have our ego. And this is the one that's in the center of our mind. And by the way, if any of you have seen Guardian of the Galaxy 2, I think after going through this information about Freud, the character of ego suddenly becomes like 100 times more interesting. But this is our most human side of us. It's in our conscious mind, and it's what's paying attention to reality. For example, I'd love to eat the chocolate too, but let's face it, I'd also like to be healthy. I don't want diabetes. I'm going to have to eat that broccoli. That's the reality of the situation. Maybe I have a tiny piece of chocolate and I have a good helping of broccoli. So this is kind of our executive of our personality. It's kind of what keeps us in control, keeps us focused, it keeps us on track, and it's more organized. When the id is more in control, people tend to have impulse issues. When the ego is more in control, they tend to be so cold as to be rational, and they're often thought of as not really having a heart. See, I told you that character became interesting. And last but not least, our friend, the superego. Now, this is the one that's got a little part outside of the conscious, but most of it's in the preconscious and the unconscious. The superego is like our moral side, okay? And it tells us, you know, you ever have that little like in the back of your mind, that little thought like, oh, I don't know if I should do that. That may not be a good idea. The superego is your conscience. It talks to you, tells you, hey, makes you helps you to recognize the right path to go on, what's moral. Okay, people who are super guilty, it often, Freud would say their superego has taken too much control of their personality. Likewise, people who feel no guilt whatsoever, their superego may not even be working according to Freud. All right, so next we get into the theory of psychosexual development. And this is kind of the most controversial part of Freud, and you'll find this is where a lot of people tend to be a little more uncomfortable. But according to Freud, children pass through 5 stages of psychosexual development. So please note, again, we're talking about the age of a child here. Freud says the most important thing in life, our fundamental urge, is sex. That's what drives us, that desire for pleasure, that desire to procreate. And he says any physical pleasure, from drinking a cup of coffee to smelling a perfume we like to hearing a song we like, is somehow sexual in nature. And he says sexuality does not belong just to adults, but that children begin from the very beginning with something called infantile sexuality. Pardon me, sorry. So again, Freud, some people, this is where some of my students start to go, oh, I don't know if I like this. And I understand that. But again, just keep an open mind and see what we have to say. All right. So Freud's psychosexual stages, I'm going to show you the top of this chart real fast. The name of the stage, about the ages a child would be in, what is characterized by, and then the fixations. If a child doesn't comfortably move out of this stage, where could they get stuck? So I want to put this, I'll put myself over here, sorry. I'm going to move around. So the first stage is the oral stage. You think about babies, how they always have like a hand or a toy in their mouth. Well, Freud said that birth to age 2 years old is the oral stage. And this is where we're biting, we're sucking, we're chewing, and we're learning how to become a little bit less dependent on our caretaker and how to satisfy some of our urges. If we're unable to learn how to become less dependent, this is where Freud says we could have fixations like drinking, overeating, smoking, nail biting, even aggression. People who can't move past this, they tend to be orally fixated. So like maybe they're always chewing on something, or they've always got gum in their mouth or something along those lines. I'm not saying if you like chewing gum that you had a problem in your oral stage, but that's just a possibility. Next comes the anal stage, and look at the ages here. Think about what a child will be doing at 2 to 3 years. This is generally when potty training kicks in. And according to Freud, this is where children learn to control their bowels and their bladder. And so being able to control when they release feces or urine, it helps them to feel more competent. So the more positive it is, the more competent they feel. People who cannot get past this stage comfortably, who don't have a positive experience, either become anal retentive. You may have seen that before, overly organized and controlling. Everything has to be exactly a certain way. They can't let go of control. They want everything set up the way they want it. Or they become extremely disorganized and incompetent. Like they give up. Like, well, I can't control that. Why should I control anything else? The phallic stage, this is where children about 4 to 6 years old start to notice the difference in gender, and they begin to realize that there is pleasure to be found in genitalia. You might notice preschool and kindergarten kids, it's where they kind of notice, oh, boys are different from girls. You know, girls act like this, boys act like that. And this is where if you cannot comfortably resolve the conflict of the differences between the sexes, you may have two types of fixations. One is the Oedipal complex. This is where, according to Freud, the boy has a bit of a sexual attraction to the mom and he sees the father as competition. Or an Electra complex, which is where the girl is sexually attracted to the dad and sees the mother as competition. And it doesn't necessarily mean that there's a overt desire there. It just means that they're looking at competition for the same sex gender. Latency, ages 7 to 12. Kids in this gender you ever hear the kids, oh, you know, girls have cooties, boys have cooties. Well, this is where latency kicks in. They generally tend to prefer the company of their own gender. They repress those sexual feelings and they begin to look at the external world and how they can gain pleasure. Playing video games, playing baseball, hanging out with friends. If kids in this age can't kind of resolve that conflict of where they can get their pleasure from the world, this is where they may end up with a lack of social skills and communication skills or a lack of self-confidence. And last but not least, the genital stage, which begins at about age 13 and lasts through life. This is where you see, according to Freud, an attraction towards the opposite sex. Now, again, I point out this was the 1800s when Freud was doing this. And you recognize pleasure from your sexual organs and pleasure from gratifying a sexual partner. People who are able to comfortably navigate this stage tend to be um, well balanced and adjusted, but if you can't, then you tend to have trouble balancing the different parts of your life. You may have trouble forming relationships. All right, now this is really important to talk about instinct because according to Freud, our instinct is made of two parts, and it's these two parts that are constantly fighting with each other. The first is the life instinct, known as Eros. For those of you who like Greek and Roman mythology, you may recognize Eros as the god of or goddess of love. I can't remember if it was a guy or girl. Sorry. But Eros comes from that. This is our impulse to live. We want the species to survive. We tend to manifest our life instinct through love and sex, the propagation of the species. And Eros is marked by the libido, which is this life-maintaining energy that tries to seek pleasure through sexual gratification. And according to Freud, if somehow this libido is blocked, a person might have neuroses or anxiety or depression. Now, this instinct fights with the death instinct known as Thanatos. I know, if any of you like Guardian or the Marvel Avengers, I always think of Thanos. It's very similar. This is our need to destroy, our desire to kill. And when I say kill, I don't necessarily mean like actually taking a life. But, if you ever had fun ripping up paper or smashing a can or something, that's Thanatos. It creates a lot of conflict and anxiety within us, and it can be manifested through aggression or cruelty or even suicide. So according to Freud, this Eros and this Thanatos are always kind of going at each other, and our inability to balance the two is what causes conflict for us. When we have more life instinct, we have a higher quality of life. When we have more death instinct, we have a lower quality of life. That's what Freud says. All right, this is really important. These are the defense mechanisms that Freud came up with, the idea that when we're in a situation where there's conflict, we're somehow going to react in a way that helps us to move past it. For example, repression. Sometimes you've heard this. I've seen people talking about this on the discussion board where someone might be repressed. They might have a bad memory that they hide, that they push down so they don't have to deal with. Repression is trying to keep disturbing or threatening thoughts from becoming conscious. The ego shoves them way down into the unconscious. Denial. Um, have you ever seen someone and they have a problem and you know they have a problem and you try to point it out and they're like, no, I don't have a problem. And they just can't seem to understand. And it can be anything from like a kid who's like, no, my room's not dirty, I'm not cleaning it, to someone who has a more serious problem like diabetes or an illness. Well, that's denial. Sometimes there's just too much going on and a person just doesn't want to experience it. Projection, okay? Um, there was this girl when I was in middle school who I really didn't like. There was nothing wrong with her, and as an adult, I can look back and tell you it was silly, but as a kid, she was too perfect, and she was just too nice, and I don't know how to explain it, but she drove me crazy. One day we were walking down the hall and she dropped her book on my foot. Now it was again, as an adult I can tell you it was a total accident, but as a middle school kid I was like, oh, she dropped her book on my foot because she doesn't like me. And it's like it became okay for me not to like her. So then I could say to people, well, she doesn't like me. Projection is where you take your feelings and your thoughts and you put them on another person and say, well, they're behaving this way because they have those feelings. So it's a way of making it socially acceptable for you not to like the person or for you not to believe something. Displacement. Oh, whoa, no, come back. Sorry. I clicked the wrong button. Displacement. Sometimes we're mad at something. Like maybe your mom tells you that you can't go out to the movies because you haven't cleaned your room. And you go in your room and you're really mad at your mom, but you know you can't smack your mom, right? No, we would never do that. So you go to your pillow and you start punching your pillow. Displacement is taking an impulse and satisfying it with a substitute object. Now, the pillow didn't do anything wrong to you, but you know if you hit the pillow, you're not going to get in trouble and you get those angry feelings out. Regression, this is where people kind of move backwards in time psychologically when they're faced with stress. For example, if another baby is born and a little one is potty training, maybe they stop being able to use the potty to try and get attention from mom. And then sublimation. So satisfying an impulse with a substitute object, but in a socially acceptable way. For example, my mom told me that I can't go to the movies, I have to go clean my room. And I'm really mad, and I go in my room and I decide I'm just going to clean it. I'm going to clean everything. I'm going to get it perfect. And my mom's going to be so amazed at the work I did. That's sublimation. It's acceptable for me to clean my room, but I'm taking all that anger and putting it into that. Oh my goodness. Woo, it's a lot. I thought that was a funny picture there of Freud. So what do you think? The thing to keep in mind about Freud is that his theories were very revolutionary at the time. They did lead to some interesting treatments. One of the things Freud experimented with was drugs like cocaine. How could that help us? So that was really interesting, and it led to some psychotherapy or some psychopharmacology, even though not necessarily cocaine. But there are some psychologists today who just completely disregard his work. Nope, we don't want anything to do with it. It's junk. We don't agree. But other people think, I may not like all of it, but there's some good points here that you can't disregard. So take his work for what you will. Oh my goodness. All right. I don't know about you, but my mind feels a little blown right now. Next class, we'll study for the interim assessment too. So next week, I'll see you. And just keep in mind that when we study parts of psychology you don't agree with, that's perfectly fine. You don't have to agree with everything, but it really helps to know about each approach to kind of understand the reason people look at things a certain way. So thank you, my friends. I hope this video helps you out a lot. And if you have any questions, please let me know.